Dana White has officially checked out.
Dana should start promoting fights again and acting as the president of the UFC.
I don't give a
What's up, guys? We have just done a deal to start a new boxing league with Turkey, who absolutely loves the sport of boxing.
He's not a good person. He seems to have lost his character somewhere along the way.
Everybody acts like this is a fucking career. This isn't a career. This is not a career. This is an opportunity.
I'm broke, so I need to fight.
This isn't a career. This is not a career. This is an opportunity.
Dana White will not be promoting Canelo versus Crawford after he was dropped by the promotional team by Turkey Al-Sheikh. He won't be promoting that card whatsoever. He'll be back to the UFC where he belongs doing his job.
I feel like I should apologize to the fans.
When you look at the UFC at this point, there are a lot of problems. Whether you talk about the heavyweight division debacle and Jon Jones just not fighting Tom Aspinall, whether you talk about the lack of pay-per-view sales, whether you talk about the lack of talent in a lot of these Fight Night cards and a lot of these Apex cards, there's just a lot of things going wrong with the UFC at this point, and it just seems like Dana White doesn't really care. And at this point, I feel like Dana has officially checked out. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. Also be sure to hit that join button for exclusive channel perks. But anyways, let's get into it. When you talk about boxing in the early 2000s, there was a lot of success with that, but at the same time, there was one crucial issue. They were never able to put on the fights that fans wanted to see most. If big fights were ever made, it was usually at the wrong time. Whether one fighter was too old at that point or one fighter was too young at that point, it just seemed like boxing could never figure things out. And due to this, the UFC saw an opportunity to gain market share on the combat sports space. They were looking to build off of a lot of the frustration that a lot of boxing fans had, so the UFC was looking to put on the fights that fans wanted to see. And during the 2010s and the 2010s, they were doing a great job at doing exactly that. They were putting on tremendous fights, they were putting on fights that fans wanted to see most, and due to that, the UFC was growing significantly as a company. But besides just putting on the fights that fans wanted to see, the UFC was also doing a lot of other things very well at that point. They were doing a great job at building stars. When you talk about 2016, there was a lot of stars at that point and superstars. Of course, you talk about the biggest star ever in UFC history, Conor McGregor. Of course, you had Ronda Rousey. Of course, you had Brock Lesnar. And of course, you had some other fighters as well. But at the end of the day, the UFC was doing a great job at building those stars and allowing stars to also create their own name. Besides also doing a great job at building stars, the UFC was also stacking their cards, whether you talk about pay-per-views or whether you talk about fight nights. When you look back at some of the fight night or pay-per-view cards from the 2016 era and you compare them to now, it's completely night and day. In 2016, the UFC had a lot of incentive to put on really good cards for pay-per-views as well as fight nights, and they were doing exactly that. They were doing a great job at putting on cards that had a lot of talent from top to bottom. On the bottom of the cards, they had legitimate, talented young up-and-comers. At the top of the cards, they had well-established champions or well-established fighters, and overall, when you combine those two, you're talking about really good and really stacked pay-per-view or fight night cards that the UFC was putting on. And of course, on top of that, during the 2016 era, there was no Apex. All of these fight night cards were in different arenas in different areas, whether it's different states within the US, whether it's different countries within Europe or different countries within the world. There was just a lot more incentive for the UFC to put on these better cards, and in 2016, they were certainly doing it. But what went wrong? Why are a lot of people, including myself, complaining so much about the UFC's direction at this point? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is the UFC is just not putting on the fights that the fans want to see. Whether you talk about Ilia Topuria versus Islam Makhachev, or even if you talk about Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall, these fights are just simply not getting made. And as I touched upon before, a huge pitch and a huge reason for why the UFC grew as big as they are currently is due to the fact that they were putting on the fights that fans wanted to see. So I certainly do think that's a huge reason for why a lot of fans, including myself, are complaining. But another reason for why I'm not personally happy in the direction the UFC is going in is due to the quality of the cards themselves. When you look at a lot of these fight night cards, they're borderline unwatchable. A lot of these cards are held in the Apex, which is bad enough. There's no crowd to get any excitement into any of these fights. But when you even look at the matchups themselves, they're not matchups that even have all that much meaning to them. There's not too many promising young up-and-comers on these cards. There's not too many fan favorite fighters on these cards, and there's not even fights that are being made that have any sort of meaning in terms of ranking or potential championship contention. So it just feels like these cards are being made just to fill a quota. They're just filler fights that are put on these cards to give some guys opportunities or some girls opportunities, but a lot of these fighters just aren't really UFC level or aren't really at a level to be even ranked in the UFC. So it just doesn't feel like it's a very watchable product to watch some of these Apex cards. Of course, you do get the occasional main event that does actually have some meaning in terms of rankings or potential championship contention, but if you're talking about one fight that has meaning on a card that has 13 or 14 fights, it's not necessarily the most appealing thing to most fans, of course. But even besides the Apex cards, when you even look at some of these pay-per-view cards that are coming up or some of these pay-per-view cards that have already happened, they're not even all that exciting. A lot of these cards have a decent main event, but when you look throughout the card themselves, they are pretty watered down. Very rarely do we get a card that has two title fights that fans actually care about. Usually it's one title fight that is actually a really good fight and another title fight that fans don't really care about all that much. There's also not too many times where we get a legitimate #1 contender fight on these pay-per-views. There's also not a lot of times where these cards are just stacked from top to bottom. Whether it's 5 fights on the main card that are all very exciting fights and even some exciting fights on the prelims as well, usually it's one or the other. Usually you're either going to get that #1 contender fight, but the rest of the main card isn't going to be all that great and the prelims is definitely not going to be good at all, or you get a card that has decent fights on the main card, but you're not getting the 2 title fights, you're not getting the #1 contender fight. There's just usually something that's missing on most of these cards. Now obviously there are a couple of cards a year that are actually pretty stacked. Usually you're talking about 2 or maybe 3 cards a year that are legitimately stacked, but besides that, most of these cards are pretty watered down. But the last reason for why I'm not personally happy with the UFC's direction is due to their manufactured stars. In 2016, as I mentioned, they did have a lot of stars. They had Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, and Brock Lesnar, of course, as well as some others. And a reason for why those stars became stars is because they did it by themselves. They naturally had star qualities, they naturally were very good fighters, and the UFC did a great job at pushing the stars that created themselves. But at this point, it seems like the UFC are picking guys that they think will be stars and they're just pushing them from the beginning. And a lot of times, these fighters that the UFC thinks are going to turn into stars just don't have that star quality. And now we're getting a push for some of these guys that the UFC thinks are going to be stars or thinks are already stars that just aren't. And this is really backfiring on the UFC. A great example of some of these manufactured stars are Sean O'Malley and Bo Nickel. Obviously, Sean O'Malley is a legitimate, really good fighter, and even Bo Nickel to a lesser extent. But when you get these push for guys that are seen to be stars by the UFC, but are just not stars to the rest of the fans and the rest of the general public, it really does backfire. The UFC at this point seems to think if they put Sean O'Malley in an immediate title shot against Merab Dvalishvili, it's going to sell very well. But I'm here to tell you, I highly doubt that card is going to sell very well. In terms of the pay-per-view card itself, it's not all that stacked. There's not too many great fights on that card. And in terms of the top of the ticket, Sean O'Malley is just not the star the UFC thinks he is. He doesn't sell pay-per-views as much as the UFC thinks he does. And at this point, I think it's just going to continue to spiral out of control in a negative direction for the UFC if they continue to look for stars as opposed to let stars grow themselves and then give a push to those guys. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is why? Why does Dana White and the UFC not care about the company as much as they used to? Well, in my opinion, I think it comes down to one sole reason, and that's ESPN. When you look at the contract that ESPN has with the UFC currently at this point, they pay the UFC a flat rate. Regardless of pay-per-view numbers, regardless of how many viewers the UFC gets on their fight night cards, it's one flat rate for the year. And I think at that point, the UFC just has no incentive to pay guys more, to have higher profile fighters fight on these pay-per-view cards, to stack these pay-per-view cards, to stack these fight night cards. There's just no incentive for the UFC to do better than they're doing right now. They'll make the same money regardless. And I think that's a real problem and a real reason for why we're at the point where we're at currently. So what's the solution? Well, in my opinion, I think there's only one solution, unfortunately, and that's for the UFC to sign with Netflix. At this point, it does seem like that actually may happen, and if the UFC does sign with Netflix, their deal could be a little bit different. The pay-per-view model could be eliminated. Netflix as a company could push the UFC a little bit more than ESPN has to put on better events, and that may ultimately save the UFC as a company, and that may ultimately save the fans, just like you and I, to be able to watch better overall products, better overall pay-per-view cards, and better overall fight night cards. But of course, at this point, we don't know what's going to end up happening with the negotiations, where the UFC is going to go, and I guess only time will tell what does end up happening. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the UFC is going to sign with Netflix, and do you think the UFC is going to put on better events in the future, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy it, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.